Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the second anniversary broadcast of, or webinar, if you like, of In Conversation Live from the Royal Society of Medicine. And this evening, we've got a return interviewee, Henry Marsh, famous author of Do No Harm and Admissions, famous neurosurgeon, and actually altogether, all-round good chap. I'm really proud that we've been doing these for a couple of years. And actually, I last interviewed Henry on this program in May 2020. And we talked a lot about COVID, which was the current crisis then. Now, of course, it's Ukraine. And Henry has this amazing history of supporting the Ukrainians in terms of neurosurgery and training. So let's start with that. I think we have 1,000 plus people logged in for this, and so I'm sure loads of questions will be coming through. I have to say it's a slight random thing about which questions get asked because we get so many, but I'll try and put as many as I can to Henry. But Henry, let's start off with Ukraine. I mean, what are your thoughts? You know it probably better than almost anybody else in the UK.
I'm very, very distressed and unhappy. Whatever happens, Ukraine is going to be left terribly damaged, and there'll be thousands more deaths. And we're looking at a complete tragedy, and it's not yet played out by any means. I have many friends there, they're okay. I'm not particularly worried about their lives at the moment, although one of them has a house in Irpin, which probably no longer exists, although he doesn't know at the moment. But I mean, what it means for Ukraine is terrible. And I fear it's very bad for the rest of the world also, but it's impossible to know. I am very, very anxious and very disturbed about it.
Henry, not everybody will know, about your history of going there. I mean, you've written it in your books, but not everybody would have read those. So just give us a bit of background.
The story is that I went into medicine relatively late. After leaving school, I did voluntary service overseas. I then went to Oxford University, where I had PPE, not personal protective equipment, but politics, philosophy, and economics. And for various reasons, I did a special study, a special paper in Russian and Soviet politics under Archie Brown, the professor of Russian politics at St. Anthony's, the spy college. And I suppose in some ways I was fated to become a spy or a diplomat or something. But for various reasons, having got my degree, I trained as a doctor and then discovered neurosurgery, which was and remains, in a sense, the great love of my life, Ukraine being the second great love of my life, other than my wife and family. And purely by chance, in 1992, 1 year after Ukrainian independence and the collapse of the Soviet Union, an English trader who was hoping to sell British medical equipment to a newly independent Ukraine, more or less randomly rang up my hospital, the old Atkinson Morley's, because his uncle was a local pediatrician. And this guy wanted to, there was a famous neurosurgical hospital in Kiev, or Kiev as it was called then. And his uncle said, oh, ring Atkinson Morley's. There are neurosurgeons there. And so to cut a long story short, I went out to Kiev a week later with two other colleagues, one a pathologist, one an anaesthetist. And the idea was we would give lectures as a sort of goodwill thing to help the trader maybe sell medical equipment. And although I knew a lot about the Soviet Union and how backward it was in many ways compared to the West, I was still absolutely horrified by the conditions I found in the hospitals I visited. And I met there a very dynamic, enthusiastic young surgeon who was the only person who actually openly said to me, look, everything here is terrible. And then eventually, with in fact the support of the head of neurosurgery in Ukraine, who was a great sort of Soviet figure, Academician Ramadanov, this guy, Igor, came to work with me in London, and he spent months with me. And I then made regular visits back to Kiev to help him. And to begin with, we were doing things that nobody else could do, because I was taking out microscopes, lots of second-hand medical equipment, which I'd drive from London to Kiev. And he became very famous as a result. And his clinic was very successful. It's a long, complicated story. Eventually, we fell out because essentially it was a bit like Animal Farm. I thought I was helping him rebel against the tyrannical Soviet professors. And alas, he became a bit of a tyrannical Soviet professor himself as he became more and more successful. So I then changed tack and started working with some younger doctors, mainly in a children's hospital in Lviv. This is now about 8 or 9 years ago. I always felt very strongly there was a sort of political element to my work. It wasn't just medical, clinical work. All medical systems reflect the society they serve. It's why with the National Health Service, if you live in central London and you go to one of the big teaching hospitals, you'll get world-class treatment free of charge, or taxation, not free. And if you live out somewhere in the remote northern bits of the country, you will not get very good treatment. And this inequality, which people are always rather reluctant to admit to in the NHS, reflects, of course, the enormous inequality of English society in terms of wealth distribution. If you look at the Scandinavian countries, which have a much less income inequality, their tax-funded healthcare systems work very well and don't have the inequality problem we have. So I was well aware of the fact that the Ukrainian, post-Soviet Ukrainian medical system was monolithic and autocratic in the way that Soviet society had been. It was eminence-based rather than evidence-based. The professor's word was written on tablets of stone, and the only postgraduate training system was the professor's son. It was completely nepotistic. But then medicine in the Soviet time, in the Soviet Union, was very nepotistic as well. And there are various sort of complicated reasons for that. So I always felt I was trying to introduce freedom and light and evidence and rational discussion and all that sort of stuff, which we tend to take for granted on the whole in this country. And I don't think I was very successful. I made some very good friends with whom I'm in touch with every day now. But that was the background story. It was clinical work, but with a sort of very definite political element to it. And Ukraine has been struggling to become free. It is a genuine democracy, terribly corrupt. There's a big problem with oligarchs. About 10 oligarchs own 50% of the economy. So even more extreme than Russia. But it has a free press. It is democratic. It is historically desperately trying to get away from Russia. The history of the country is complicated. Western Ukraine was never part of Russia. It was subsumed by the Soviet Union in 1946 at the end of the Second World War. Before then, it was part of Poland and Austria-Hungary. In Western Ukraine, they all hate the Russians, almost without exception, and always have done. Eastern Ukraine, Russian is the first language, as opposed to Ukrainian. And certainly people were more sympathetic towards Russia as you went east. Crimea was always pretty Russophile. I think it's a safe statement to say that everybody in Ukraine now hates the Russians. Putin has done more than anybody else to unite Ukraine.
And do you think it's a kind of civil war, basically?
No, it's not a civil war at all. Russia, I suppose you have to understand Russian attitudes to Ukraine by analogy with sort of English-British attitudes to Ireland in the 19th century. Condescending, ownership, the equivalent of all the jokes about stupid Irishmen, which the English used to like to regale themselves with. In Russian, is jokes about stupid Ukrainians. And is a very patronizing attitude. Ukrainians have always been underdogs to the Russians, underdogs to the Poles, underdogs to the Austro-Hungarians. It gets very complicated, the whole ethnicity aspect. But Ukraine is a definite culture. It has its own language. Its sort of founding linguistic father was a poet called Taras Shevchenko in the middle of the 19th century. And politically, there was a strong nationalist movement for Ukrainian independence in the latter part of the 19th century, like in much of the rest of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So Putin's claim that Ukraine doesn't really exist, it's not true, it's just completely false, it's not true.
I'm going to try and break the record for the number of questions I ask, which have been sent in. So we've got 4 so far. Evie Rourke, which is question number 4. As usual, we've got a question from Dr. Addy, who always asks some questions, and he says how wonderful our conference was on COVID last week. Thank you, Dr. Addy. But Evie says, you mentioned your medical work in Ukraine was also political. Do you think it's the responsibility of doctors to be political? That's a good question.
Well, it depends how you define politics, of course.
Mm-hmm.
But I mean, yes, all doctors work in a social framework. And certainly in this country now, the NHS is struggling without a doubt. And I think if you're going to be responsible for patients, you have to be alive to the political aspects to it as well. And one should be politically campaigning. So I think you can't separate medicine from politics, particularly because medicine, healthcare is getting more and more expensive, both because of technological change, but also because of the aging of the population. And most healthcare systems are struggling to a certain extent. This country very much so. And it's politics as to how much money you put into the healthcare system. And that's in a tax-funded system, how honest the politicians are going to be in saying, look, if you want good healthcare, you're going to have to pay more. And they don't like doing that. They don't like putting taxes up. Although, of course, now Johnson has put national insurance up, which is supposed to help with healthcare. It's all highly political.
Yeah. Well, we'll come back to training of doctors and also hospital buildings. I know you're interested in that. But Joe Best, thanks, Joe, for your question. Can you tell us about your work training Ukrainian doctors remotely with the David Knott Foundation?
That was very much David Knott's work. He contacted me because he knew I had lots of contacts in Ukraine. And he had this idea, he wanted to have a webinar about war zone surgery. And I put him in touch with various people I knew, and I did a little bit on neurosurgery. But actually in war zone surgery, neurosurgery is trivial in a sense. I mean, 25% of deaths in battlefields are from head injuries, but the actual acute management of head injuries in a war zone is very limited. You don't carry out major brain surgery. If somebody comes in coma with a penetrating injury, you triage them to have no treatment. So what neurosurgery is done in a battlefield is non-urgent. It's done within 24 hours to repair superficial open injuries. Very different from civilian practice. But this essentially was David Knott's initiative. David is now out there in Ukraine, and I'll be very interested to hear back from him when he returns what he finds. I know that he's been told he must not say where he's going or what he's seen, because I know from my Ukrainian friends that, of course, there are major Ukrainian casualties, and the Ukrainian government, understandably, is not publicized in this fact. They publicize the Russian military deaths, but they're not public. They're reluctant to publish it their own. But there are huge losses going on at the moment.
We'll see if we can get David back on this program, and we'll ask him those questions.
No, he has unique experience. I suspect the Ukraine. I mean, there's no shortage of doctors in Ukraine. There are loads of hospitals of variable quality. The Ukrainian army, after the invasion of Crimea in 2014, has been radically overhauled and trained. And I don't know, but I'm pretty sure the military medical service has been brought up to date as well. So I'd be interested to know from David whether he finds actually there's not a lack of knowledge. There may be a lack of equipment, a lack of supplies. But I suspect the Ukrainian military medical system is ready. The other question, of course, if you have mass casualties. But at the moment, the areas which are most affected, Mariupol still, you can't get anybody out. So the hospitals don't have water or electricity, so clearly people will be dying, probably in hundreds, if not thousands, who cannot receive medical treatment.
Yeah, and there is a request for donations to Ukraine at the beginning and the end of this program. But Simon Jones, thanks, Simon. What do you feel about lots of UK students heading to countries like Ukraine and Georgia to study medicine? Do you think they receive empirical and robust level of training?
No, probably not is the answer. I mean, the medical education I saw, undergraduate, was very old-fashioned, and it's probably variable. I wasn't very impressed. There's a huge problem with postgraduate training. The professorial son system still exists. I know, I haven't been in touch with her recently, the reformist American Ukrainian health minister, a very impressive woman called Ulyana Suprun. And she made herself very unpopular by making it impossible for the medical students to bribe the examiners for their exam results. It was standard practice in the Soviet Union and still pretty standard practice in Ukraine. You paid a bribe to the examiners and they passed you. She introduced a system whereby the exam papers were written in Ukraine and in America, then brought to Ukraine more or less under armed guard, and then taken back to America to be marked, which meant that the examiners no longer got their bribes and they were very poorly paid. So whether you call it a bribe or a supplement, whatever, but their doctors are paid virtually nothing in Ukraine, and they depend upon gifts, call it a bribe, from patients. And the students are jolly unhappy because they had to work. So when you have sort of corruption in every level of society like this, it's very difficult to escape. But the fact of the matter is Ukraine, it was trying to do that slowly. These things don't come quickly. So I'd be fairly skeptical about the value of a undergraduate medical education in Ukraine. I might be wrong. Postgraduate training is no system. You have 2 years, it's the old Soviet Russian system. After getting your basic medical qualification, you have 2 years of sort of theoretical lectures. The Soviet system, you had a whole separate echelon of theoretical doctors who just taught medicine but didn't practice it. There wasn't this sort of complete unison we have, and Europe and America has, where the teaching is done by practitioners. And then after 2 years, you can say you're a neurosurgeon. You go to a certain number of lectures, which I was told were a waste of time. And if you actually wanted clinical practice, you either had to pay the head of a department to be on the staff, or you had to be the professor's son. And that, still was basically the system as far as I could see until now.
Well, a bit of a plug for the RSM, because one of the things we're trying to do is to improve our digital education, and actually, interestingly, over COVID, we've increased our reach by a factor of 5 because of these the online.
Yeah, no, that's very good.
Yeah. Okay, Safia Stratford. Thank you, Safia. Anything in particular that you learned from the Ukrainian doctors you work with, Henry?
Very good at improvising. I mean, it's a paradox if you work in adverse conditions without all the equipment we have. In some ways, you have to be a better doctor. One part of technology in medicine is to make it easier and safer. So it's a very sort of mixed picture. Ukrainian society, and it is a society where the state was still more or less your enemy. It was changing. But the Soviet Russian tradition, of course, is the state is your enemy. And it's been like that going back, to the Tsarist times. And if the state is your enemy, the only people you can trust are your family and close friends. So the Ukrainians have very, very strong family networks and friends and help each other. And you'll be seeing that at the moment in the war. So that I learned, and there's a toughness and hardiness to Ukrainian society, which we lost a long time ago because our lives are so easy.
Yeah.
And in the 20th century, at least, 18 to 20% of the population of Ukraine died violently in the civil war of the 1920s, the famine of the 1920s, the Stalin famine of the 1930s, and then the Second World War. So it's a very hard life. And what is happening now is a continuation of this ghastly, tragic tradition.
Okay, Harry McCall says, what do you think? This is the last Ukrainian question, because there are lots of other things about dignity and dying and about training and so on. So the last question on Ukraine will be from Harry McCall. Thank you, Harry. What do you think is the most impactful change that you were able to make in Ukraine in your time working out there?
Probably very little indeed, other than that I made good friends. And it meant a lot to them that somebody from Western Europe loved the country and wanted to go there and continue to go there for 30 years. They being underdogs, they have a sort of inferiority complex vis-a-vis the West. So although I never learnt the language, although I took a genuine interest and took the country seriously and didn't look down my nose at it, like certainly the Russians do, that probably was more helpful than anything else. Yes, I helped some individual patients. I helped some doctors. You'd have to ask them. I think the achievements are very modest. I set out with high ambitions, but I don't regret it in any way.
You put the country on the map with your books, your best-selling books, of course.
I suppose to a certain extent I did, yes.
Yeah. Actually, there's one last question from Richard Worth, which I think it's worth asking. He says MSF is working out in Ukraine.
They're in Dnipro,
They're well used to working in challenging situations. Presumably donations to them will be money well spent to assist in Ukraine?
I would have thought so, yes. Yes, and MSF is good, so
it's a good organization.
Yeah.
Okay, let's switch the subject then. And Rachel Melstrom says, in the light of your support for this, how do you suggest we act as doctors to enable dignity in dying bill to progress? I mean, let's cover the whole issue of that, the dignity in dying.
The stumbling block is members of parliament. And I think that if one believes in assisted dying in one of its many forms, the people to focus on are members of parliament. And one should write to one's MP. That I think is, and support the organizations, either Dignity in Dying, which goes for the 6-month terminal diagnosis qualification, or the MD, My Death, My Decision. I support both organizations. The MD is intractable suffering, not just 6 months terminal prognosis. But the problem is MPs. Yeah. Why so many MPs are so against it, I don't quite know. Jeremy Hunt is talking about having who is chairman of the Select Committee on Health and Social Care, is talking about having an inquiry into it. So whether that will happen or not, I don't know. I hope it does. He's not unsympathetic, I believe.
Yeah, he was actually in the RSM last night. I was talking to him last night, and he did sound quite positive about it. So I think maybe he's the way to lobby.
Yes, and MPs. But it's entirely a problem with MPs. I mean, opinion polls show time and time again that 70 to 80% of people favour it. Yes, then if you ask more complicated questions, it's not quite so many, but it's still an overwhelming majority. But there's this very powerful and determined clique, for want of a better word, mainly of palliative care doctors, who are adamantly opposed to it and justify. They come up with lots of hypothetical arguments against it. But what's fascinating is, of course, this is no longer an evidence-free area, because assisted dying is available in so many countries now. You can look at them and say, well, where is the evidence that abuse is happening? Well, the answer is not. But the arguments against it are entirely hypothetical. And we all know as doctors, level 1 evidence, level 2, level 3, expert opinion is the lowest form of evidence. And it's the expert opinion of the palliative care doctors, which is what they roll out all the time, and entirely hypothetical.
Now, there's a couple of comments coming in saying, taking exception to your description of the north of England as being, a slight, a different zone from London. But I think what you're saying is the great
economically. Well, I mean, okay, if you look at the big cities, maybe not the case.
Yeah.
But I mean, this country is hugely unequal in terms of its wealth, in terms of social class, and geographically as well. I've got nothing. I worked for 6 months as a theatre porter in Newcastle, in Ashington. I love the Northeast. I mean, it's not to being the North. It's the fact that wealth is so unevenly distributed in this country. And there's no question of the fact there's a big difference between the big expensive teaching hospitals in the big urban centres and small DGHs. I mean, hence all the scandals over the years with the NHS. One of the reasons for it.
Yeah, well, David Whittaker points out that the Charnley hip operation was devised in the north of England.
Yeah, no, sure. No. I mean, I don't want my words misinterpreted. I'm talking about inequality. Yeah, and we all know that a huge, London and the southeast is very privileged compared to the rest of the country economically.
Yeah. Let's move on. Tithanka Data says, do you think doctors and medicine would benefit from a wider educational training like yours with your...
Well, I think I was very lucky because I had two complete different degrees. I don't regard medicine as hard science, just as politics, philosophy, and economics isn't hard social science. But I think I was very fortunate to have had a sort of double university education. For many years, I was involved in the training of many American neurosurgical residents who came to Atkinson Morley and St. George's to work with us. And in America, of course, medicine is a post-college degree for most people. So most of my American trainees were older. They'd all been to college first. Because in America, there's this silly idea that neurosurgery is the acme of the medical profession, which is not. Neurosurgery is just another specialty. But they were all incredibly clever and with the amazing American work ethic. So I can't say it was all just because they'd been to college. But it would be expensive. I've always favored, I thought the idea of accelerated graduate entry schemes, I think is a very good idea. I don't want to belittle people who haven't done other things first. But it's always struck me, particularly now I'm retired, the really difficult bits of medicine are about getting on with people, getting on with patients, getting on with colleagues. The surgeon is a surgeon. The operating, in a sense, is easy. Everything else is difficult. And I think if you have more experience of life outside the medical world before you become a doctor, I think it's a bit better. So I think it's a good idea, if it's economically possible, which it probably isn't, that people should do as many different things first before they train as doctors.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I think some of the best doctors I know came in as mature doctors. They did something else differently. I think they were, they benefited from the training. But Jonathan Denfy says, I think your comments on how politics and medicine can't be separated is very interesting. It's a F1 who studied in the Northwest and now works in London. I can see the inequality within the UK quite clearly. Do you think that's something we should be educating medical students about in terms of politics?
Yes, I think so. I think medical students need, I don't know what it's like now. I had a traditional medical student education 40, 50 years ago, where it's just medicine, it's anatomy and disease. There's nothing about the social context in which one practices medicine. I don't want to overload the medical student syllabus. And there's still, there's a huge technical side to medicine we all need to learn. But I think some discussion of the politics of healthcare and the economics of it would be very helpful. Maybe some medical schools do it. I don't know.
Harry McCall, we get lots of students watching this program, actually. I'm pretty sure that Harry McCall, he may or may not be a student, not sure. Hi, Harry, whatever you are, welcome to our program. He says, what piece of advice do you have for medical students currently aspiring towards neurosurgery. I mean, it always used to be said, you don't have to be a brain surgeon to understand this. So, I mean, people do think that
brain surgery is not very difficult, and brain surgery is no more difficult than any other surgical specialty. Right. What's, in my opinion, what's special about brain surgery is it's so bloody dangerous. It's not technically any more demanding in terms of the handwork than anything else. But because it's so dangerous, because there's so much morbidity, and there's so much illness we can't treat, and because the brain is so sensitive and delicate, that doesn't mean the surgery is particularly sensitive or delicate. It just means we cause a lot of damage to people's lives. And that's what's special about it. So I think to be a good neurosurgeon does call for a lot of human qualities rather than purely technical ones. Having said that, I mean, I expect most people go into neurosurgery mainly because they find the brain so fascinating, which I certainly did.
Yeah. Well, Samantha Vincent, actually, this was the first question that came through, but I've been kind of saving it for the right moment. She says, as an aspiring doctor, I guess she is an aspiring doctor, how do you offset the moral weight that comes with handling life and death? That's pretty much what your book is about, isn't it, really?
How do you offset it?
Yeah. How do you balance? How do you live with the fact that so many of your
it changes over the years. When I was young, I mean, when you're young, when you become a doctor, you have to pretend you're more knowledgeable and better than you really are. Patience is intolerable as a patient to think that the doctor looking after you actually doesn't know what they're doing. So as young doctors, we're faced by this sort of blind trust, more or less, and which we know, in a sense, we don't entirely deserve. So we have to pretend. As I say in all my lectures, there's nothing more frightening for a patient than a frightened doctor. Nobody ever told me this, but we just learned it instinctively. You have to hide your feelings. And when we're young doctors, we are often anxious. When we're older doctors, we're often anxious as well. It's the nature of the work, because we care for our patients, and it's sometimes quite dangerous. But the problem is, human psyche being what it is, the best way of deceiving other people is to deceive ourselves. And I ended up, I think, when I was a young doctor, with this sort of inflated ego, which was really me propping up myself, as I had to believe in myself in order to get the work done. It's only as you become older and much more experienced, and then you know what you're doing, you know your limitations, or you should do, that then it's a bit easier to stand back a bit and be a little bit more honest with yourself about how difficult the work is. You have to believe in yourself, but the problem is not to believe in yourself too much. And the solution to this, if there is one, is to have good colleagues who will help you and criticize you. And increasingly, I think most of the problems in the practice of medicine come down to teamwork and having good colleagues, both for your own mental health, for your decision-making, your learning skills, given that training is such a problem now with a lack of experience, particularly in the practical specialties like surgery. So I think, again, the emphasis on working with colleagues, being a good colleague. I don't know if it's taught in medical schools or in postgraduate programs at all, but this seems to be more and more important in the modern age. The sort of system I trained in was see one, do one, consultant as God, like in Ukraine, and we really need to get away from all that.
Caroline Richardson points out, actually, it's really tough to get into as a graduate now, graduate entry, even more difficult than it is to get in as an undergraduate. So thanks for that comment, Caroline.
I think that's very unfortunate. I think that's a mistake.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Henry, when you and I worked at St. George's together, you remember back in, I think, 2005, we had Modernising Medical Careers.
Yes. Alan Crockard, yeah.
Yeah,
I remember going on the demonstration about that. MCAS, yes.
Tell me your view about those very important changes that were brought in 2005.
Well, it's complicated, and I don't. So many things have changed over my lifetime in medicine. It's very hard to point to any one single factor, but there's no question the fact that the shorter working week has a huge impact on not just on training and experience, but on team working rotas. Teamwork is all about knowing people, working together often for quite long periods of time. So you develop mutual trust and friendship. I think that's a lot more difficult now for junior doctors because of the rotas, because of the hours they work. It's kind of compressed into long spells and then you're off for a while. I'm not saying we should go back to the very punishing rotas I worked, and anyway, it was much less intense. I never worked less than 1 in 2 or 1 in 1, but I usually got enough sleep at night. And I don't think that's the case now because the whole pace of everything in hospitals has changed. But I think I'm passionately opposed to Brexit, but if there could be one sensible consequence to Brexit is if the European Working Time Directive could be re-examined in the context of medical training. In America, it's 80 hours a week for residents. It depends on the specialty as well. Some specialties are more demanding than others. But I think the blanket, whatever it is, 40-hour week or something, I think has been very damaging. As to the whole run-through business, I don't know. I mean, when you and I went into medicine, you spent about 3 or 4 years mucking about before you were quite certain what you wanted to do. I always, when I see medical students nowadays, I say, don't make your mind up too quickly. You're doing F1, F2, try to get a feel for the different specialties and see what would suit you. I was always very wary of neurosurgical candidates who said, I've always wanted to be a neurosurgeon ever since I was 3 years old or something, But the answer is very complicated. One needs to look at what happens in other countries. I always remember when I was involved with the European Association of Neurosurgical Societies, the training thing. I knew the French training inspector who went around all the European training centers for neurosurgery, which included Turkey, although it's not part of the EU, it's part of Europe. And he said, when he's up in Scandinavia, all the trainees were complaining and miserable and this, that, and the other, but they had this very nice work-life balance. And he said, when he went to Turkey, they were all working madly long hours and they're all blissfully happy, seemingly. Because surgeons, I'm not saying surgeons, we want to operate, Yeah. And again, the huge increase in consultant numbers may be good for your life outside work, and in many ways is necessary in modern life with working wives and everything, and working spouses, I should say, and everything else. But it reduces the amount of work, and surgeons aren't happy if they're not operating. I was talking to Neil Mortensen, the president of the Royal College recently, and I said, do you miss it? Because he stopped operating now. He said, no. All I wanted to do when I was in practice was to operate all the time. And I exactly the same. That's all I wanted to do, as caring for patients. I don't miss it, but that's another story. And I think it is a problem now, because I mean, the average consultant surgeon in this country now is lucky if he operates more than 1.5 days a week. And there are some new consultant jobs where they have 1.5 sessions in 2 weeks, Neil told me. I mean, this is extraordinary. We'll have a whole new generation of really very inexperienced surgeons. And surgery is a practical craft. You learn it by doing it. You don't learn it by reading books. You need books, but you do it over and over again. Oh, 10,000 hours business. We all know that.
Yeah. Rachel Green, thank you, Rachel, says, what would your opinion be about the lack of support for neurosurgical trainees, especially registrars? From what I've seen, there are limited debrief opportunities, yet there's often bad news to break. I know your book touched on this, but I'd love to hear more about this topic. What do you think about that?
Well, I only know the one department I worked in for many, many years. I might be deluding myself, but I'd like to think on the whole there's a very good relationship between the trainees and the consultants. I mean, my impression is different surgical units develop different cultures. St. George's AMH, I'd like to think, was relatively gentle. I know other places which are much tougher. I've always favoured gentleness. I think the work is very hard, but again, you'd have to ask my trainees. They might say Marsh actually was a bit of a bastard, you know, he's deluding himself. But I think it's very important. I think it's, and again, I mean, I've stopped, I teach now, but I mean, medicine is so much more in an adversarial atmosphere. There's more litigation, there's more in the newspapers, more management, much more frightening. It's always a bit frightening, but I think it's much more difficult now. And I think the trainees need a lot of support.
Yeah.
And I don't know, the problem is, well, it maybe that would slowly change over the years, but if the consultants who are brought up in a rather brutal way, they tend to inflict on their juniors in turn.
There's a question from David Ward, who I know is a cardiologist and very keen on whistleblowing, and I think he has a very good point about that. He says, what do you think is the possible explanation for the huge enmity between hospital doctors and hospital managers?
Well, all professions have that. My father was an academic lawyer and said there was always this sort of rivalry between practicing lawyers and academic lawyers. It's to a certain extent human nature. But it's also because the NHS is sort of cash, and the management's role is basically to try to save money. I mean, there's always talk about efficiency, but given we can't actually measure, we can't quantify the output of medical treatment on the whole, with a few exceptions. You know, efficiency is a meaningless concept. All it means is cheap, cheaper and cheaper, and the management there are there to make things as cheap as possible. So it's bound to be rivalry. Having said that, though, an awful lot of managers are themselves doctors. And we all like whipping. I used to like to be rude and slag off the management. I think that's probably wrong on the whole. But what doctors do, because we have this, most of us have this intense sense of personal responsibility towards individual patients. It's kind of, you know, it's hard to have any sympathy with the management's point of view. And of course, until the Griffiths report and managed Margaret Thatcher, we didn't have managers in the NHS. And okay, it wasn't necessarily very good. It was all, the hospitals were all run by the senior doctors. But I mean, it's an ideology that hospitals need management. And I don't know, I'm skeptical about it sometimes.
Yeah, you were rude about managers in your book. I remember quite.
Yeah, it's nice to kick managers. You know,
in a humorous way.
Yeah.
You're also rude about the computers.
Yeah, well, that's a problem we all have. And I know my American colleagues are driven absolute despair by e-notes and e-records and the time spent having to become. Doctors have all become, you know, data inputters.
Yeah, and the passwords to get into all these different computers, but that's a whole different. I've got a good question from Molly Malaby. Hello, Molly. She says, "Hi, Henry. I'm a student aspiring to do medicine. You said you chose neurosurgery because you were fascinated by the brain. What do you think differentiates people who are interested in the brain but study neurology rather than neurosurgery?"
Well, I mean, surgeons like operating, you know, surgeons like power and drama and excitement. We like frightening ourselves. Neurologists aren't like that, you know, they don't want to be frightened. Surgeons certainly do, and certainly neurosurgeons. I mean, yes, I was fascinated by the brain, but I also liked all the drama and excitement and importance of it as well. I mean, I'm just being honest, that was the case. And neurologists want a quieter life. And it's more like solving puzzles rather than doing dramatic interventions.
I don't want to be rude about physicians, but people used to say that if you're a physician, you have to decide whether to do nothing today or to wait till tomorrow and do nothing then.
Yeah, well, that's true to a certain extent, but obviously with modern therapeutics, it's a bit different. I always liked the sort of tongue-in-cheek neurosurgeons calling neurologists thinking doctors, you know, as though it's a bad thing to think. You know. No, I mean, I had very nice neurological colleagues on the whole. And there's not very much interface between neurologists and neurosurgeons. It's quite different, say, from cardiac surgeons and cardiologists. But no, I think it's wanting a quiet life and not wanting the stress and excitement of surgery.
Yeah,
is the difference. But shared fascination with the brain.
Yeah. Well, as a prostate surgeon, I know that when things were fine when they go fine, but when they go wrong, it's very extremely disruptive, emotionally and so on. So Ali Akgun, thank you, Ali, says, because of the COVID pandemic, many students have had little practical experience and remote learning has been widely used. What can be done in order for the student to get more practical teaching?
Go out to district general hospitals and try to see as much practical medicine as possible, I think. And I learned, maybe different now, but I learned all my practical, useful medicine when I was sent out to hospitals outside London.
Okay, Jonathan Bowman, this good question coming in at 7:44. Thank you, Jonathan. Illuminating discussion, he says. Communication skills seems really well taught amongst healthcare professionals, but I can't think of any formal teaching I received as an undergraduate about how to be a good colleague. I think that's really, really important.
I suspect that's true. And it is something, I mean, I'm sure it's something that can be taught. I mean, ultimately it's taught by example. You know, we're all human beings, we're all very mimetic. And if you work in a department where the senior doctors are pretty detached or cold or rude, you tend to pick up bad habits, and the opposite is the case too. So I don't know if any of the colleges or medical schools sort of run programs about this. I suspect they'll be preaching to the converted. You know, the people who go to them are probably already sympathetically inclined. But again, it's one of the advantages for working. One of the advantages of the old pre-run-through system was you had to apply for different jobs all the time. You had to go from SHO or houseman to SHO to registrar or senior registrar, which meant, first of all, you had to keep up with writing papers and literature because you were having to sell your CV every year or two. But it also meant you worked in different departments, and it's hugely useful to work in different departments and see how things vary from place to place. And I suspect that how hugely influenced it is by the behavior of the consultants.
Yeah. And I have seen consultants' lives ruined by fighting amongst themselves.
So I, yeah.
You know, I can think of departments that have been dysfunctional for years because the consultants.
Yes, exactly. No, it kind of gets into a vicious spiral and and then there's no going back.
Okay, Heather Collins says, thank you, Heather. How do you think the public's view of medicine and doctors in particular has changed since you started practice? With the advent of the internet, patients are becoming their own Google-trained doctors these days.
Well, it didn't really affect me because I had a very specialized practice. And by the time Googling came along, I was pretty well established. So I rather liked Google. If I saw a patient with a problem I wasn't sure, I'd say, well, let's have a look on Google. So I'd turn to the hospital computer and Google the problem and try to get some answers. So I've always, you know, it's more difficult to do that when you're a junior. You don't want to show you don't know something. When you're older, it's easier to say, well, actually, I'm not sure. Let's look it up. So it never really bothered me. It may well be more difficult for GPs, you know, if patients turn up with long lists from the internet saying this, that, or the other. On the whole, I found, but it may be because I had such tunnel vision, the patients really hadn't changed in the 40 years of my career. And having worked in countries all over the world, I'd say the same. We're all very much the same when we're ill. you know.
Yeah,
We
yeah.
want the doctor to get us better. We're in awe of the doctor. We're very reluctant to complain or criticize. And we're all typical human beings.
And I think the word trust is crucial. Patients have to trust
Absolutely.
their doctor, particularly if they're going to operate on their brain. Alicia Ryabova says, "Hello, I'm an aspiring student interested in medicine. For the past few months, I wanted to become a neurosurgeon after reading your book. Do no harm.
Join the club, yes.
But nowadays, I've been interested in becoming a combat medic. What advice would you give for people deciding which specialization in medicine?"
Well, you need to actually work as a junior doctor in a department doing what you want to do. If you're interested in combat medicine, you need to work in A&E and trauma and orthopedics. If you're interested in neurosurgery, you need to be an SHO in a neurosurgical department. You really are not going to get a very good impression as a medical student when you're on an elective or something, not unless you're completely hell-bent on something in particular. So you have to actually get some practical experience as a doctor, if you can, as to what suits you. And one of the great virtues of medicine as a career is there are so many different sorts of medicine, ranging from, pathology, psychiatry, dermatology, to brain surgery and cardiac surgery. There's so many different things that it's unlikely you won't find something that suits you.
Yeah. A couple of questions. We're running out of time. Catherine and then Jessica, thank you for both of your questions. Catherine says, how do you tell somebody there's nothing you can do? Nothing that you can do.
Sometimes I've failed. If a patient had been looking after for many years, because I specialized in brain tumors that killed people very slowly over many years, I can think of one or two patients where I just couldn't do it. I couldn't bring myself to say it, which I think was bad. In terms of breaking really bad news that you have to do all the time in neurosurgery, particularly with head injuries and strokes and hemorrhages and things like that, there are a few very simple rules. One is always sit down. The other is say as little as possible. Usually, in fact, the message is very simple. You may, in neurosurgery, you'll more often be talking to the family rather than the patient. Patients probably going to be unconscious on a ventilator. To say as little as possible, just speak in very simple terms and say, I'm afraid, I think probably they're going to die. We're doing everything we can, but you must be prepared for the inevitable, whatever. But the temptation is, usually the family is so shocked they don't say anything. And the temptation to start talking too much and kind of filling the silence. So my message about breaking bad news, other than sitting down, is tolerate silence. Never appear to be in a hurry. And if you say your bit and then nobody says anything, just sit there saying nothing. And actually, that's really difficult. But that's probably the most effective thing you can do.
Okay, Jessica Longmore says, Henry, emergency physician here, 10 minutes left. How can the NHS be fixed? Because it feels very, very broken.
It does, doesn't it? The answer is, the short answer is it needs more money. Simple as that. Where you go from there, I mean, in the early noughties under Blair and Brown, they were throwing money at the NHS. It wasn't necessarily all well spent, but it needs more finance. And I'm worried the present government don't really have much sympathy with it. And we're perfectly happy if more and more people are driven into private healthcare. I don't think we're necessarily going to privatise the NHS, but I do worry that a two-tier system will develop, rather as we have the great curse of this country, although I'm a great beneficiary of it, so to speak, is a two-tier educational system. And I'd be very, very sad if healthcare started to go down that route in this country, which is, of course, the American route.
Yeah, of course. Okay, so Ron Cooper, not too much time for any more questions, but we've had some great questions coming in. Ron Cooper says, do you think surgeons nowadays are too concerned with being blamed when they go beyond the norm, as seen from the evidence base, i.e., do you think innovation and individualism, well, I guess you're a good example of a real individual, is being lost?
I don't know. I mean, on the whole, progress in medicine now has lots of very little steps with a lot of cooperation and teamwork. The era of the great sort of maverick individual making major breakthroughs, I suspect, has gone. I mean, yes, I'm a bit of a maverick, and David Knott is a bit of a maverick as well. When I met him, we got on very happily together. But I don't think really that's the future of surgery on the whole. Yeah. I think it's much more about cooperation and high tech and politics and efficiency and things like that, and money.
And teamwork as well as money.
Teamwork. Yeah. And, okay. And I've said it already, I say it again, that the other really important thing about teamwork is for your own sanity. You know, if you go to work and you have good colleagues and you look forward to talking to them, it makes the work, the stress of the work, so much less.
Yeah. I mean, one thing about money is that you know, the buildings that we practice our medicine in, compared with the US, for example, are pretty shabby, aren't they? I mean,
most of them are, yeah, and they're shabby and badly designed. If you go to some of the hospitals in Scandinavia, but that's so much nicer, you know. More windows, more light. They've actually been designed with some thought about what it's like to be in them as a patient. Most NHS hospitals and all the PFI hospitals are very poorly designed. Yeah, very unimaginative.
Well, towards the end of the program, I asked the people I interview, you know, about their proudest moment. But actually, Mubashara Khan is saying, "What is your greatest achievement, Henry?"
Medically, the thing I get most pleasure from is seeing the roof garden, which I created outside the 2 neurosurgical wards at St. George's, because they're given. The balconies were there kind of by mistake, and they're just empty. And I'm pretty sure nobody else would have done it, but I raised the money with the help of colleagues, and we've got this wonderful garden there, so the patients can get straight out of their beds onto the roof, get outside, see the fresh air, and there are lots of plants and trees and big tubs. And whenever I go into the hospital, I go and look at the garden, and it makes me feel very happy, because I know it's made a lot of staff and patients. During COVID, it was hugely useful for all the exhausted staff to go and get a breather. We're now trying to raise money, a charity who I'm involved with, to turn all the balconies outside our building into gardens. So when you arrive at St. George's, you'll see the Atkinson Morley Wing as a sort of green wall, which would be wonderful.
We've got 2 more minutes, and actually David French has just sent in a question. He says, "Wonderful conversation. Thank you. Thank you, David, for that compliment. We've talked about dysfunctional departments and about management, but we haven't mentioned leadership. Where does that come from in the NHS, and where should it come from?"
Well, I was actually exchanging comments with Jeremy Hunt about this recently. The real need is for clinical leadership, which means consultants. I think the relative amount, I've never been terribly keen on the Royal Colleges, but because I'm a maverick and impatient. But I thought it was a huge mistake in the early with Blair and Brown, in the wake of the Harold Shipman and Bristol and all the various other scandals. But the Royal Colleges are kind of bypassed and sidelined, and the GMC was bigged up, and you had PMET-B and all this bureaucratic change. I felt the way to improve healthcare in the NHS, apart from putting more money into it, which they were doing in the early 20s, in the noughties, is that the Royal Colleges ought to be more actively involved in patient safety, but with some degree of supervision, some degree of transparency and monitoring, to make sure they're not just ending up, brushing things under the carpet. Because ultimately, as doctors, we're not very sympathetic to non-clinicians telling us how to treat patients and all the business about aircraft safety and this, that, and the other. So I think there's a huge need for consultant doctors to have more say again in the day-to-day running of their wards and their practice. Easier said than done. But there's been a huge change in the 40 years I've been in the NHS in the degree of autonomy and responsibility that consultants have. Yeah. But the consultants are the longest lasting element in any hospital. They're there more than anybody else. The average chief executive lasts 4 years.
Yeah.
Consultants are there for 30 years.
Good point, Henry. We're running out of time, and don't go away. I've got a couple of announcements. Firstly,
Right.
thank you. Secondly, thank you for everybody who's tuned in. Thirdly, thank you especially for the people who sent in questions. I tried to get through as many as I could, but I see there are more that I haven't had time to ask you. Next week, you've got me back again, but more importantly, you've got Kim Darroch, the ambassador for Washington, who got booted out because he wrote a report about Donald Trump and Donald Trump found out about this.
Yeah.
He got ejected, a bit of a maverick, maybe like you, Henry. And the following week, we're going to try a new format, which is an in-person conversation. In fact, Henry, you might remember you and Stephen Fry did that right at the very beginning.
Yes, that's right. Along with Rachel Clark. Yes.
Yeah. Good old Stephen and Rachel, wonderful people, both fantastic writers like you. Well, on the 20th of April, we've got Angela Rippon, the broadcaster, read the news to us for years and years and years and did all sorts of other interesting things, including Antiques Roadshow. She's coming into the RSM on the 20th of April, and we're going to have a dinner afterwards. You better come along, actually, Henry. I'll try and sell you a ticket as well as everybody else. Right. She's a lovely person, and she's going to support the RSM by coming and talking to us. We'll do an interview with her about her interesting career in the media. So it's about £100 a ticket to listen to her and then have dinner. A really nice dinner in the RSM. So please do come along to that. It'd be your way of supporting the RSM, which has had a hard time during COVID. We lost a load of money because our building's been closed. But of course, the people in Ukraine having even a much harder time with what's going on there. So if you'd like to make a donation, you've got a way of doing that. £10 donation, giving to text 70150 for a £10 donation, and that's for the Disaster Emergency Committee. So Henry, thanks so much for your second appearance. Well, third appearance. Actually.
My pleasure.
It's been such fun talking to you as always, and better get working on your third book.
No, it's coming out in September. It's finished. I've corrected the page proofs finally yesterday.
What's the title going to be?
And finally, given my advanced prostate cancer and other things.
No, well, I'm going to buy a copy of that, and I'm sure people.
I'll give you one if you're well behaved. I might give you one.
Take care, Henry.
All right, bye, everybody. Bye.
Bye.